I think we've all had this moment, right, where you're like, okay, if I left fundamentalism of the right, I don't want to become a fundamentalist of the left, right? Like, I don't want to become the other of what I'm trying not to be, just in a whole different way.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to the Ex-Vangelicals podcast, where being labeled a heretic is a good thing, if it means refusing to conform to toxic, harmful expressions of faith. We address your questions about God, politics, how we got here, and how to move forward. Nothing is off limits in our conversations with scholars, spiritual seekers, and activists in our quest to uncover the heart of faith. We're your hosts, Melanie
and Gary Allen,
and this is Holy Heretics. What do you do when your questions and doubts and frustrations with the church at large will no longer be tolerated by your church? How do you move forward when something in you tells you you can no longer participate in the faith you were given unless major changes happen, but your church tells you to stop what you're doing or leave? Our guest today, Tim Whitaker, has been dealing with just that. He is the creator of the viral Instagram account, The New Evangelicals. And on that account, he aims to create conversation and help push the Christian faith forward. But as we'll see, this hasn't exactly been met with open arms. So, hi, Tim. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me. And thank you for saying viral. I mean, wow. I am honored to even have that word associated with my account. So thank you very much.
I mean, you've only been doing it since like December, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's viral.
Okay, I'll take the win.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
I love it. So, Tim, we're excited to talk to you in particular about the New Evangelicals, which is an interesting name for a deconstruction account. Most of us going through deconstructing our faith, and I would say including myself, really want nothing to do with evangelicalism anymore. And I think that may be a little too negative, but that's kind of where I'm sitting right now. So I find it interesting that you chose that name. Can you tell us why? And then are you looking maybe to simply reform evangelicalism or to re-envision the church in a more healthy way in the future?
Yeah, well, let me just say first off that I'm very much like you a lot of days where I'm like, get me out of here. What am I doing in here? Give me the Molotov cocktail. I'll be the first one to throw it in the building, right? Like I understand that. I see the problems. I mean, I call it the AEC, American Evangelical Church. It is very problematic for a lot of reasons. And we can be here for 3 hours or more talking about every single one. The reason why I chose New Evangelicals is because I just had this moment where I was actually, I'm not sure if you guys know who Sean Foyt is. The Bethel, Let Us Worship guy. It was like, I don't know, maybe September last year. I'm watching some video that he's doing, and I'm just sitting there, I'm just steaming like, oh, this is so wrong. He's missing it. And in a moment of frustration, I just went, we need like a new evangelical movement. Like this one sucks. And then I thought, New Evangelicals, like that's kind of catchy. Yeah. And I checked to see if it was taken. I assumed it would be, I think it's a decent name and it was available everywhere. So I said, well, I might as well grab it just in case, who knows? And then I launched it in December. But honestly, the heritage of the evangelical movement historically in America is actually way more complicated and way more center left in a lot of ways than the current expression that we're even experiencing now. There's a lot of reasons for that. But one of the reasons why I thought to myself, I want to really get back to like the heart of what it means to be evangelical, which is someone who tells the good news, who tells good news to people. And we are not doing that anymore. And I ultimately believe that the gospel, and that's a very loaded term, so loaded, and depending on who you ask, you get different answers, and we can unpack all of that if you want. But ultimately the idea of Jesus being good news still means something to me, and I think that name should be reclaimed for our cultural context because it's hurt a lot of people. So I'm giving it the old college try. I don't think I have any secret formula here because a lot of us have come and gone, but a lot of us are still very obsessed with Jesus, right? Like. We left because not everyone, but at least in my circles, most of us left because we're trying to be better Jesus followers, not not the opposite. So I totally get why people have ditched a label. It's a very valid reason, frankly.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Can you define evangelicalism for us real quick, just before we move forward? Well, like,
Like
what's
our
your
current
definition of it?
Oh, good. Well, that's one of honestly, that's one of the major problems because the term evangelical and evangelicalism is a huge umbrella term, right? You got guys like John MacArthur and Kenneth Copeland in the same umbrella of evangelical. And
Mm.
for those of you who don't know, John MacArthur is a very conservative, like very literal reading of the Bible kind of guy, and Kenneth Copeland is a famous televangelist who's actually the wealthiest like Christian pastor in America right now.
He's the
Pretty
guy
much
with the creepy eyes, right? Like
totally.
he's yeah,
Yes.
yeah, okay.
Yeah. So they live in the same bubble. But I think that a safe big picture definition is someone who would see the Bible as somewhat authoritative in their life, who would affirm the death and resurrection of Jesus, a literal resurrection, not just a spiritual one, and would probably most evangelicals do lean politically right, especially white evangelicals. So there tends to be a very common thread. 80% of them or more lean right wing as well. So there is definitely a political side of this that we just have to admit.
Right.
Okay, and so we can settle the debate once and for all. Can you just pronounce the word for us?
No. Oh my goodness.
I do it both
Evangelical,
ways.
right? And I call it evangelicalism. That's what I say.
There you go.
Really?
I mean,
You
Settled.
do? But I say what do I say?
Yeah, what do you say?
Evangelicalism.
Evangelical. Is that wrong?
No, I don't think so.
No,
Oh,
it's
man.
funny because it's totally a regional thing, but I had never heard it until you, Gary Allen. And then I was like, what is
I'm gonna start saying
this?
evangelical. I'm from Arkansas. I can't even read. So
The diamond of the South.
What can you do? That's right. Yeah.
The diamond of the South. Amazing.
Okay, so to get back on topic here, can you tell us a little bit about what disillusioned you with the evangelical church? or like what started your crisis of faith, or whatever term you'd want to use, deconstruction, whatever. And then also, I mean, you've kind of alluded to it, but where would you say you are in your faith right now?
Yeah. Well, I've been very privileged in my life to be around great people ever since I was really 18. I was actually part of a small community type group of people, that wasn't a part of any official church. It was really in between a church plant and like a small group. There was about 40 of us. And it was called 11th Hour. And that was where I started rethinking church. So the journey started with, what is church? Like, what is it? What are we doing? It's safe to say we were all kind of deconstructing church at the time, thinking about different models, listening to different authors such as Frank Viola, who wrote the book Pagan Christianity. So we're really steeped in this stuff, trying to rethink like what is church. And of course, over time, that eventually leads you to ask questions. Well, what's the gospel? And what's the Bible? And these questions just kind of keep going. But when I would say maybe theological deconstruction really took hold. I've always been on this path, but when the mountain really got steep, so to speak, right, and I was really going down the deconstruction trail here, it was probably about 4 years ago. I was 28, and I got hit with a really, really random but intense, like anxiety panic disorder that just hit me literally out of the blue, like a light switch. One day, boom, this is happening. Really
Wow.
bad panic attacks and anxiety and like crazy stuff. I lost a lot of weight. I wasn't eating. And that really taught me so much, even more than just theological things I had to think through. But that was the beginning of me having to do some really self re-examination and some self-reflection, and through therapy and just kind of now gaining new categories. Like I didn't really understand anxiety or depression. I never quote unquote struggled with it. Right. But now when it happens to you, it changes everything. And that led me to really rethink, like, what do I believe theologically? So I grew up in a very Calvinistic home. I was homeschooled for 9 years. Great parents. My parents are great people. It wasn't really about them and them teaching me this. It was more about the churches and circles that we were in. But Calvinism pretty much says that God has preordained from the beginning of time who is saved and who is not saved. Like it's all been predetermined, and you're either God will wake you up one day and save you, or else you're just, that's it. Like you're on the road to hell. And
Right.
when at 28, I'm like, okay, I need to figure out, like, is this really true? Like, how can an all-loving God really be doing this? It doesn't make any sense, right? And all the arguments I've heard, and I was pretty deep in this theological stuff for a lot of years, they weren't adding up. So that was one of the big moments in my life where I said, I have to really like rethink a lot of my theology around the Bible, around the nature of God, around the theology I've been taught, and kind of start rethinking. And then that's when I thought, even to myself, I have to kind of deconstruct this. And then I found out, of course, deconstruction is like, it's the newest buzzword, right? We're all kind of going through it. But honestly, we know it's nothing new. So, but yeah, so that's where I've been, and where I'm at now, to answer your other part of your question. Of course, I'm not really sure. Do I affirm some kind of divine presence that we can call God? Yeah, I'm definitely not an atheist. I've thought through that enough. Do I think the Bible is full of wisdom and even in a sense God inspired? Yeah, but just not in our Western fundamentalist terms. But yeah, I definitely think that the divine worked through humans, and this really crazy collection of writings was somehow preserved to now in some way. We can debate, how accurate they are. So all that for me is just kind of on the table, right? Like, what does hell look like? I don't know. I just read a book from Bart Ehrman, Heaven and Hell, and that blew my mind, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, this
Right.
is like, there's much more going on here than what I was taught, about essentially being taught that, okay, evangelicalism is all there is. This is Christian. They're one and the same. And if you leave evangelicalism, you're leaving Christianity, only to find out that that was one small piece of the Christian pie, and the
Mm.
waters are deep, wide, and complex.
I love that. It's funny you say that. I actually just tweeted that today, talking about the fact that deconstruction isn't ripping away Christianity. It's just taking apart a version of Christianity, which for many of us doesn't work anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Mm-hmm.
okay because we're not destroying Jesus. We're not destroying the church. We're just reframing what we think about Christianity, and it no longer is encapsulated exclusively in evangelicalism.
Right. That's
So yeah,
exactly right.
I said it right that time.
You
So
did. I'm proud
you
of you.
you were you were at a church when you were doing this, correct?
Yeah. I mean,
You
I've,
were,
I've been actively involved in churches, including one recently. Yeah.
and so how did they respond? Did they know about your deconstruction and your account? I mean, what's the narrative around that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty transparent, period. I got just the way I'm wired, I can't live like a dualistic life. It's very much what you see is what you get. I'm very consistent no matter who I'm in front of. The version even what I'm doing now, it's the same Tim when I talk to my wife later on. It just is, right? Obviously, we're not perfect. We get that, but there's not like a different side of it. So yeah, I was at a church for the past 6 years that I really planted myself at. My wife and I discovered it 6 years ago, and we said, you know what? We're going to really kind of marry the church, right, so to speak, because you have to understand, I'm also a drummer, and for a lot of years in my circles, drummers were needed in different churches, and I built a pretty robust network. So for a lot of years, I would just fill in, play here, play here. I loved it, and then eventually we decided to settle. Yeah, the past like maybe 2 years were where things got a little more, I wouldn't say tense, because I'm very relational and I make intentional time to get coffee with people that I know are thinking, hey, I'm not sure about this Tim person. Like I would meet up with my senior pastor almost monthly. My worship pastor and I were very close. I was part of a team of 4, my worship pastor, 2 other volunteers, and me, who kind of led the worship ministry together. We were very intertwined. Like it was very close. A lot of intimate moments shared emotionally, which for me, being a type 6 on the Enneagram, is a big deal because I'm a loyalist. So that's very important to me,
Mm.
is relational. So I've always been outspoken on social media, even before New Evangelicals, on my Facebook account. I've been known by my friends, as the controversial guy, not even trying to be, just sharing thoughts, right? Like, hey, we should rethink the evangelical church. Oh, you're so controversial. It's like, why? Like, they're hurting
Right.
people,
Yeah.
like,
Right.
like, okay, most evangelicals lean politically right and think that Black lives aren't that important in the grand scheme of things. That's problematic. That shouldn't be
Mhm.
controversial. So
Right.
I guess what is my normal to some people is controversial, which it is what it is. I understand. And I've had to get better with tone. And, I want to solve problems, not make more problems, clearly. So this kind of came to a head after the George Floyd situation, because for me, that was a huge shift mentally of, okay, I have to really rethink my views on race and racism in America. And the Ahmaud Arbery in particular, it still gets me choked up because I saw that video. It absolutely wrecked me. I mean, I was just like
Mm.
broken at my table, feeling so helpless and powerless. And then seeing, of course, the narratives come out. We all know the stories. We know how the right will spin it. We know how it goes. And yeah, at that point, I was getting more vocal on social media and just more like direct. Like, this is a problem. We have to address it. It's not Marxist to admit that Black Lives Matter. It's just not. Surprise, it's biblical. So I know I'm a little long-winded here, but I'm trying to set the stage. So I apologize for that. But essentially what happened was in August of 2020 was when my pastor and senior pastor, worship pastor, kind of brought me into the office and were like, hey, we should really talk about your content on social media. It was fine. They're good people. I still believe that. They're not bad people. They're not maniacal. They're not Mark Driscoll's, like in the back, like plotting how to control
Right.
people. They're not that way. They just have a certain persuasion. So things got tenser and tenser from that meeting on. I even wrote them a letter and I read it to them saying, hey, this is just who I am. If it's a problem, I'll resign from these ministries. And I didn't. They didn't tell me to. And then
But
8
you
months.
weren't like paid staff. You weren't
No,
paid staff.
full
And they
volunteer.
and they still brought you into the office. Like, that's a little
Yes.
heavy-handed to me.
Well, in evangelical circles, I think it's kind of par for the course.
Hmm.
Honestly, especially in worship, you have to understand, and I'm speaking with a broad brush here, not every church is this way, but in this more modern worship approach, you have this worship team. If you're on the platform, you're seen as a leader, you sign a document stating, what the rules are. And I agreed to all of them, I wasn't
Sure.
drinking publicly, stuff like that, which to me, it's not a big deal. It's not my cup of tea. I'm not a big drinker anyway, but whatever, I'll play ball.
Right.
But
Sure.
the social media opinion thing was kind of new. Like, well, there's nothing in the handbook about this, guys. Like, what's the problem, right?
Guaranteed
And
there
then
is
yeah.
now. Guaranteed
Well,
they
yeah.
added it
Yeah.
after
Yeah, it's
this.
the Tim Whitaker section of the statement of faith,
Yeah.
aka Tim
The
Whitaker
Tim Whitaker
comments.
clause.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a weird dynamic. It was anyway, until what happened recently. We can get into that in a minute, if you want. But they were good people. We got along great. I talked to my senior pastor over coffee. We talked about the church. We talked about our pros and cons. We talked about things we agreed on and saw differently. I find that there is unity among diversity. And I think a lot of churches want unity and conformity. And that's such a perspective shift for me. I don't operate that way. Right? Like a good example is Joe Lumen. I love Joe Lumen on Instagram, right? I've interviewed her. We talk, we text. We don't see eye to eye. I need her perspective in my life,
Right.
like I need the diverse opinions. So yeah, so it was good, but definitely like I can kind of feel, a little bit of tension there. But for me, I'm okay with that. Yeah.
So then they eventually were like, now we can't do this anymore?
Yeah. So 5 weeks ago, my senior pastor got lunch with me and very cordially, very politely told me, listen, I'm boiling down the conversation to this. You either adjust or stop your social media presence, either one of those. And it was not defined. Or you can no longer serve on the worship team at this church. You have to resign because I can't have someone who is saying things that contradict my teaching who's also on the platform with me. I said, okay, well, if that's the two options I'm given in this moment, I have to resign for a number of reasons. I mean, I had like 3 or 4 major reasons I'm saying I have to resign. And I did. And, I don't like to dehumanize people because I don't like division. I really don't. I mean, I was even part of a worship ministry called Resignate out of this church that brought the capital C church together every other month. At our peak, we had 60 different churches coming out to these nights, over 100 volunteers from 15 different churches. On the stage was 8 different churches represented among the band. It was a beautiful thing. So that is my heartbeat, is like togetherness, even if we don't see it the same way. So I say that because I still say that they're good people. They're not bad people. They just have a very fundamentally different perspective over what leadership and what volunteering means.
So what exactly was his biggest gripe? Was it your political leanings? Was it like comments about the Bible? Like, what do you think it was that was the tipping point that he said, "Okay, you've gone far enough. We can no longer allow you to be a part of our community"?
Yeah, two parts, and I should also mention that they did offer. They said, "Listen, you can definitely still come and attend. You just can't serve on the platform." So it wasn't
And
like,
you
"Hey."
can give your money too, right?
Yes, you can also probably
Yeah.
keep your money. Yes, yes. So anyway, the big ones that in that meeting were the tithe, and I'll explain why. There's context to that. And the other one was the LGBTQ issue. Now, nothing
Oh,
was
yeah.
specifically given to me as like, hey, here's the post in question. It was just,
Mm.
hey, the way you talk about these things. And I'm very open on my account that theologically I'm still working through the LGBTQ issue, even though I'm fully affirming as a human being. Like we should make
Mhm.
space for people in that community in the church period, even though I'm still working through some of this stuff on my own personal time, right? So, and the tithing one was because I guess he preached on tithing one Sunday. I ended up talking about tithing on my account, and he saw that as like a direct attack against him. Keep in
Oh,
mind,
wow.
though, I've never mentioned my church by name ever on my account, and I've only
Huh.
always talked about them anonymously in a very positive way, intentionally. So,
Mm.
Mm.
it's not like I'm like, oh, pastor, love your preaching. Then online, I'm like, my pastor's preaching is terrible. Here's why he sucks. It's quite the
Right.
opposite. I use my church as an example of, hey, look, some churches do volunteering really well, and my church does it really well, or they handle COVID really well. They're not anti-mask. So I
Mm.
tried my best, to really make it as positive as possible. And it just seems like,
Mm.
it just wasn't enough.
Hmm.
How did this all go for your wife in all this? Like, was she like, you know, was she on board? Did she wish you would tone it down? Like, how? And then how did it feel for her knowing that you were being treated this way?
My wife is a type 2, and that means that she's a giver and she's fiercely loyal and feels very defensive
Mm.
of her friends and family. My wife was pissed. She was
Mm.
angry. And she's probably been even deconstructing more than I have. Like we've talked about like her beliefs and where she's at, and we're not in the same spot in some ways. We have to make room for that. But she was really not happy. I mean, she was really hurt, I think, for me. And also the fact that no one even talked to her. Like the way the situation happened, it wasn't well organized. I'm not going to say it was maliciously done. It just wasn't. My worship pastor and senior pastor weren't in the same room when we had this conversation. So I'm hearing
Mm.
one thing from my senior pastor one day,
Huh.
different thing from my worship pastor a different day. Then 4 days later, I'm told, oh, by the way, this Resonate thing, you can't be part of that either anymore, even though I was one of the main drivers behind that. I find that out 4 days later. So it's just
Mm.
like gut, it's just like punched into the gut after punch to the gut. So the way it was handled wasn't very
Seriously.
consistently clear. And my wife was
Mm.
very angry. I think she
Yeah.
still is pretty frustrated and pretty aggravated. Like she was really
Mm.
hurt by how it all went down, especially seeing that when I'm in something, I give everything. So, and I do it happily, by the way. I was never guilt tripped into it. But volunteer. I'm not sure how much you guys are into music or worship, but making Ableton sets, like doing high production stuff in the back. Like I gave a lot of time. So I think it really hurt my wife to see that there was no room for me theologically, and that trumped the relationship.
Mm.
Mm. Gosh, I think this just this just points to what you're trying to do is like say there are problems that we have in the evangelical church at large, and we need to talk about them, and then a lot of them need fixing. You might get to the point where you're like, oh, okay, so maybe that one that I thought was a problem isn't actually a problem. But what you're saying is there needs to be a dialogue. There needs to be the healthy tension of saying like, are we carrying out the mission that we said or like we say we live for? Are we serving people? Are we actually as a church doing that? And I find it so interesting that most of these churches then go, there's one person in charge, they can't be questioned. Well, he can't be questioned typically.
Yeah.
And not only that, but like what a testimony that would have been had he been able to keep you there and say, you know what, we're okay with this. We're going to show the rest of the congregation what it's like to differ theologically and still be able to be the body of Christ. And that's what's so heartbreaking to me is it's just like you either are 100% on board with me and you never question or you're out.
Mm.
I told him that directly during our meeting. I'm almost at this point. I'm pretty much crying over the table because I'm just so heartbroken. Because you have to understand, I built very close friendships with a lot of people, and we were doing great work. Like I enjoyed being there. Like there's no way around that. And I said, it's really a shame that I'm leaving over secondary theological perspectives. I'm not preaching
Yeah.
a non-resurrected Christ. I'm not saying Jesus never rose again. Like I'm not saying that. I hold to a
Right.
pretty conservative theology in a very academic sense. Maybe not politically, but academically, I do for sure. Resurrection bodily is very conservative. And it was really, yeah, it really hurt to be in that spot of like, I would brag to my account, like, guys, my church makes room for me. I love that. And now,
Hmm.
like, what do I tell them? Like, what do I tell all my friends who aren't going to see me anymore? I've been with my bass player for 5 years. Almost every Sunday we play together, and it's just one day it's just gone, like never happened. It's like that's just so bizarre. It's so bizarre.
Yeah. Gosh, I'm just I'm heartbroken for you, and I'm heartbroken for the church at large, and your one specific church too, just because it's like this could have what I think the church really needs to learn, and this is something that we never talk about though, is like how you walk through tension to get to a better relationship at the end. We don't ever talk about that. So as soon as we hit tension, we're like out, like, I can't, tension must mean this relationship is bad. And so I think what
Yeah.
that points to though, is that the work you're doing is so necessary. Like the account that you have and the questions that you pose and the way you encourage people to see different perspectives is so important. I mean, I feel like it just revealed the problems that you've been trying to say have been there the whole time. So I, I applaud you for
Yeah.
continuing on, despite, I mean, a lot of personal sacrifice. And that is something too. Like one of the things you do on your account is you just simply, in your stories, you just put up a question and you say, "Hey, what are your thoughts on this?" Like probably back in the day, you had COVID and Black Lives Matter and um, women's ordination. I mean, I'm sure you've done the whole gamut. And I mean, the other day, recently, I saw you do something on Mother's Day. You cover the
Mm-hmm.
whole thing, and it seems like your followers, or at least from the responses that you get, that people are kind of all over the spectrum of beliefs. So
Yep.
what has like reading all those different beliefs and responses and viewpoints done for you? How has it changed you and your faith? How would you say you feel like you've grown because of doing this account?
Yeah, it's tough. It's hard to really gauge it just yet because we're only about December, 6, 7 months into this experiment. Really, I mean, Instagram isn't really designed to do what I'm using it for, right? Like, I'll pose a question and I'll screenshot like 100 DMs and share them or more. Sometimes I've had up to 300 in a day.
Wow.
And
Goodness.
obviously, listen, you can't read every single one all the way through. Sometimes I get like 7 or 8 messages in one shot, right? And it's like, okay, I have to read as much as I can, understand the thought. I respond to every DM. I at least give it a heart minimum, and I try and always say like thank you for sharing, because people are sharing like very intimate things about their lives. I mean,
Mm.
they just do things that to me are just like, wow, this is. I mean, I'm like, there's been a few where I've like wept while I'm typing back. I'm just like, this is just crazy. I think what it's taught
Wow.
me, it's kind of confirmed my suspicions. Maybe is a better way of saying it. That evangelical Christians, people who grew up in this evangelical, bubble, have questions that they don't feel like they can talk about in their church without fear of getting kicked out. I hate to say that I'm a walking testament to that, because I was hoping to be the opposite. I was hoping to be a walking example of that, of proof that there are churches that are doing good work in this way. But it just goes to show that the rigid, I'm going to say fundamentalism that has overtaken the evangelical movement did not stick like how they think it did, because people will smile and raise their hands in worship and applaud the pastor, but then they'll go home with questions that they don't know where to go to. Like, who do I
Mm.
ask these real questions about? How do I ask, is God really burning people forever without feeling judged? Like, of course he is. What are you, a heretic? Like, hell's eternal conscious torment. That's the only way to ever view it. People have real questions about that, but that's the answer they get in the church. So I think I've learned that people have real questions and people have different opinions. I do my best. I think we're all here. I think we've all had this moment, right, where you're like, okay, if I left fundamentalism of the right, I don't want to become a fundamentalist of the left, right?
Mm.
Like, I don't want to become the
Yeah.
other of what I'm trying not to be, just in a whole different way. So I
Yeah.
really do my best, and we all have our biases. I have mine, just to be okay with like sharing more conservative perspectives too, and saying, guys, people think this way. We have to listen. They want to share. We have to respect that in dialogue. That's how you change people, right? Is by dialogue, not by screaming at them. So that's kind of some of the things I've learned so far.
Hmm. Have you had people scream at you?
I've had a few people really get into it with me. I had one professor who he told me that he uses my account for fodder for his classroom. I
Oh.
said, well, that's not very nice. But I what I tend to do to kind of get around like people like that is I'll audio message them. I do audio messages all the time. And once they hear a human voice who's like, hey, I'm not an asshole. I'm actually a nice guy. I'm just thinking through this
Right.
stuff. Their guard is automatically lowered. I've had people come out and swinging. You're a heretic. You're this, you're that. I'll DM them with audio. Hey, I'm Tim. I'm the human behind this account. Nice to meet you. Here's my thoughts. And then they end up apologizing. Honestly, I've had quite a few, which is nice. It's like, great. See, we can communicate even though we see things differently. Like, we don't have to dehumanize each other over different perspectives. It's possible. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've found in those conversations, like, the labeling comes out really quickly,
Yeah.
and, then once you're labeled something, it's you're either reeling from it or you're just trying to prove that you're not, or you've
Yeah.
just been put in a camp and there's nothing you can do, and
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things with maybe the more fundamentalist crew is when they say, "Well, this isn't biblical,"
Oh, yeah.
and I'm gonna go to the Bible for all of my answers, and this, the biblical definition of X, Y, and Z. And I was just on Facebook yesterday and was
I'm
seeing
sorry.
how I know
Right.
it's such a terrible thing, but I'm doing the same thing. I'm trolling, being like, "Oh my gosh, these poor
Mm-hmm.
people." But
Yeah.
it was this person who was talking about the fact that there's no way in the world that God could be viewed in female form because that's just not biblical. How do you respond to that crowd? That's basically
Yeah.
they've got the Bible and they're kind of proof texting anything
Mm-hmm.
from evolution to sexuality to marriage to the biblical definition of politics. How do
Yes.
you respond to those people? Because a lot of our families and friends are made up of those people who in many
Yes.
ways are good people and they
Yes.
really do love the Bible, and yet they may not realize that they're actually not reading it very intelligently, much less was it ever supposed to be used as a weapon.
Oh, man. First off, let me just say that the Bible refers to God as mother in Exodus several times. So
Right.
there's that for those biblical, literalists over there. It's
Right.
definitely there. Actually, a nursing mother to be exact. But
Mhm.
yeah, that's a phenomenal question because we have to understand that the view that we get from those people that has been exported to evangelical culture in a lot of ways is a very new way of looking at the Bible historically as an absolute truth in like a scientific way,
Right.
right? So there's like wisdom of the Bible. Is the Bible true in the sense of like, is the wisdom it offers true? Well, yes, like Proverbs, it's full of true statements that are just wise. Is the
Mhm.
Bible camcorder footage every time?
Yeah, no way.
No, it's just not. And we can trace this back. We have the data. We don't have any of the original manuscripts. That shouldn't scare Christians, okay? But because we've been taught that the Bible is essentially beamed from heaven down to us in English, once cracks in that start to happen, aka reality, we lose our minds because we're like, oh my gosh, like this is like God's direct word to me, me. And it turns out that maybe it wasn't, but that there's still truth in here. I'm a humongous fan of Tim Mackey, Bible Project. Love the work those guys
Oh,
do.
yeah.
He's phenomenal. And he's the one who I've listened to so many of his podcasts, and he does such a great job of letting the Bible speak on its own terms. And that's something that Dr. John Walton would say as well. The Bible was written for us, but not to us. Major distinction. Major distinction. Now, as far as how do I deal with those types of people, online, not very much. I don't really engage because you're never going to win. Because how do you unpack all those layers in a comment when they can just go, here's the Bible verse, you're wrong? It's like, well, okay, I guess in this arena you win because you can say the most amount of quote unquote truth in the least amount of space, right? Here's the Bible verse. It's God's word. There's no context. This is what it means. You're right. You're wrong. I'm right. The end. And then how do I respond? Well, what is the Bible? Page 1, right? Like there's so much, there's so many layers we have to unpack before we can even have the conversation of how you're applying this Bible verse. Bottom line. So I in longer form, I try and have DM dialogues via audio message. I'm actually interviewing someone on my podcast next Thursday who is a outspoken pastor who tells his followers do not wear masks as a sign of fighting the tyranny of the government. And I'm like, dude, we should talk because I have a lot of questions for you.
Oh, my
a
man.
lot. And we're gonna get into this. Because I want people to hear what he has to say, and I have a lot of questions I want answers to. So you need a longer format, Gary Allen, you really do. But the bottom line is we also, on a big picture level, have to really get back to thanks to scholarship recently, we have unprecedented amount of information about the Bible. And that should be a good thing to push us forward, to put the Bible in a very healthy place. But unfortunately, in our circles, it's really become the fourth part of the Trinity. It's become God itself. In a very rigid interpretation model that if you deviate from, you're now heretical, which historically is just a bunch of nonsense.
Well, and I think what it is actually doing is the opposite of what they want, which is it is leading people to abandon faith in droves because
Totally.
it's just it's a house of cards, and at some point you go off to college or you become an adult and you realize wait a minute, this way I was told that the Bible was inerrant and perfect and 100% literal and fully historical,
right?
And that I have to read it everything from that lens. And once one of those pieces falls apart, then you're left with nothing. And so
You're
you
right.
walk away.
Yep.
And it breaks my heart actually because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's the Bible was never viewed that way until what 150 years ago.
The Enlightenment, that was a big
Yeah,
movement, big part of it.
no one thought the Bible was literal and historical and that Genesis was an actual account of creation. That no one has ever thought that except for modern evangelicals. And I think that's what makes me sad is there's so many people running away from Christianity for the wrong reasons. So kind of what are you trying to build that would really replace that in a beautiful way? Yes, we can talk about how bad it is, as you said, but what's the future? What are you building and pointing people to that is more beautiful than that version of faith?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to point people towards the reality that the Bible is way more beautiful, complicated, and messy than we ever knew, and that's a great thing. I'm trying to tell people that you can't do real theology on social media. Okay. You just can't. All right. I'm not going to claim to do it on my account. If you're getting your theology from me, you're making huge errors, right? Especially now we have access to scholars through podcasts, through YouTube for free. No other generation ever had this. You can look up any scholar you want and find their lectures for free. Take advantage of that, right? These guys are guys and girls. They're neck deep in things. I mean, John Walton's book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, beautifully explains the narrative of Genesis 1 and how it's more about chaos and order than physical material. And when you read the book, you're like, oh my God, this makes so much more sense, right? So that's one aspect. And a church aspect, I'm trying to get us to realize that the evangelical institutional mega church model, the industrialized megachurch has traded values. So we've traded the value of community. That's a very early church model value we see in scripture and also in church history. We've traded that for institution, for system, and for event. Okay, so the event has trumped the community. Churches will say that they're all about community. Churches will say, welcome home, you belong, right? But what that means is you belong as long as you're here on a Sunday morning and you're
Right.
in a seat and you're just consuming, right?
Yeah.
Like we will feed you and you just consume and you go home and you check off the box, church. And if you're a super Christian, you go to a small group. And if you want all the crowns, all the jewels in your crowns, you volunteer. That's like the hierarchy that we kind of have set up. And the reality is that value system must be replaced with the value of communal living together, which does not fit into our Western individual like secular culture's model. It doesn't fit into our current evangelical church's model, but the communal relationship of together, meeting at the table and then loving our neighbors outside of that for me, I think is a much more, I hate to use the term biblical, but much more, it's a much clearer value that we see taught throughout church history that must be reclaimed, must be. It just has to be really at all costs. And this is someone who loves the event. I played in professional events for worship for many years. I love it. My drum set's behind me, as you can see. I do this all the time. I gig out on the weekend, I'm hooked, but not for the sake of like, what is the church, right? It can't just be an event that we go to. We're missing it.
All right, so let's talk about the fruit of evangelicalism, in particular over the last 5 to 6 years, where we've really seen the culmination of the movement happen in this crescendo of white nationalism, of misogyny, of racism. And when I look at evangelicalism, in particular American evangelicalism, I see 81% of them unanimously almost voted for Trump. There is a
Yep.
wide range of anti-immigrant, anti-Black lives. They love war. They love their guns. They seem to be against a lot of the fruits of the Spirit and even the Sermon of the Mount with Jesus. So, am I being too damning toward the movement and the fruit, or are you seeing similar things from your perspective?
Well, all you're doing is citing data. We're not making
Yeah.
this stuff up. 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump twice. That's a reality. And that means that you're voting for the man who wants to grab women by the crotch. We know this, who has said things that are shockingly terrible. And for me, in 2016, when that clip came out, right? That what was it? Access Hollywood tape came out. I thought,
Yeah.
well, this is it. Finally,
Yeah,
thank
it's over.
God.
Right.
Evangelicals are going to reject this. This is a no-brainer. Who wants to vote for a guy who literally is on tape assaulting women, right? And what did
Right.
Jerry Falwell Jr. do? We need a commander-in-chief, not a pastor-in-chief. This is just locker room talk. And people bought it. That was a moment where I go, what kind of faith movement am I in? I mean,
Yeah.
I'll put it this way. I grew up, right, like I said, fundamentalist and very conservative. I was taught that we don't objectify women, that you don't look at pornography. And the guy who people voted for who told me that is on the cover of Playboy magazine. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense. Nothing adds up. Like, wait a second. You taught me this is wrong. This guy's on the cover and you still vote for him. And for me, what I think we failed to realize, and this is a very important point that goes really overlooked, we underestimate conservative right-wing media sources, period. See, here's the thing. Most people think, or most pastors think that they're the ones who are discipling their churches. But the reality is that right-wing media is discipling their churches. That's just the reality because, it's just so, the more I think about it, the more it burns me up because right-wing media like the Ben Shapiro's, the Charlie Kirk's, the Sean Hannity's love to talk about cancel culture, love to talk about how they're being censored, how big tech is censoring them. But statistically, they dominate on social media. The top 10 radio hosts in America, I believe 6 out of the 10. Now, this is not just talk radio. This is DJing, sports, any kind of DJ on the radio. 6 out of 10 are conservative talk radio hosts. 6 out of 10. So
Wow.
they dominate. They dominate Facebook. They dominate, and people have soaked it up, and that's why evangelical Christians can believe like clearly contradictive beliefs. They can say we love Jesus, we support the Bible, we think Jesus is God, and his teachings are God's word to us, like love your neighbor and love your enemy, and then can turn around and say, bomb the country next to us. Yeah, Trump's
Right.
right. They are shithole countries, aren't they? That's why they can
Mhm.
do that, because talk radio and that enterprise spins things in Christian language that are completely unchristian. Make no mistake, Fox News, they all know. They know their audience. They know their audience is some form of Christian evangelical. In fact, today, this is no joke. I still listen to talk radio because I love to keep in the loop. And we all know, Rush Limbaugh passed away. So they have people filling in for him on his talk show. And the guest today literally said, my faith in Christ is what keeps me going. My faith in Christ is like what gives me these views. And I'm sitting there like, what Christ? What
Right.
Jesus are you talking
Yeah.
about? What book are you reading? Because it certainly is not the Sermon on the Mount that gives you these views of being, everything that you said, Gary Allen, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBT, pro-gun. Can you imagine Jesus in America advocating for less gun control? Like, just picture that for a minute. Give me my AK-47 or give me death. It's like, no,
Right.
like, what the hell? So
Yeah.
you got me ranting now. You really set me off here, but this stuff really burns me up because we've been hijacked. The Christian faith in America has been hijacked by far right political commentators and rhetoric. And that's why I started my account. We have to reclaim it. It is not liberal to love your neighbor. It's not liberal to advocate for a living wage in a country that has 30% of the world's wealth and 8% of the world's population. That's not crazy. That's like expected. Like, right? If we have all this wealth and goodness, why can't people survive? Even the ones who are working 40 hours a week at a quote unquote minimum wage job. Makes no sense to me.
Yeah, well, it's not liberal to believe that every human being deserves the right to affordable health care. I mean,
Right. What?
we serve the great physician, and yet we're telling
Yeah.
mostly
Yeah.
brown and black people that they
Totally.
don't deserve health care.
It's
It's
crazy.
crazy to me.
Well, I
It's
think it's not
crazy.
even it's like it started there and it's now spreading its way up into like lower middle class of any race. I can barely
Right.
afford it myself, and
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
haven't been able to for a long time. So,
My parents own a small business. I grew up in small business. There, for them to cover my wife and my son and I, full was $1,400 a month
Wow.
just for my plan.
wow.
Okay. And that's of course deductible, copay, all that's still in there. It's a mortgage payment. Now, I'm grateful because through a long story short, we have state healthcare through New Jersey, and it's great. It's a great plan, and I'm grateful that our state has that, but a lot of states don't, right? And like you said, Melanie, that it's crazy to think that I can make however many thousands a year and still barely survive. And
Right.
now on top of that, I have to worry about if my son's to go to the hospital, what bill I'm going to get literally in a year from now. We got my wife's labor bill came 10 months later in the mail. 10 months.
Wow.
Wow.
That's
Wow.
crazy.
Wow.
So it's not too much to ask, to have affordable healthcare in the world's, again, richest nation. But for some reason, Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro and by proxy, evangelicals think it's socialism. It's
Right.
nuts.
Well,
Like,
I
what?
think a huge part of that is that they're not impacted. And so it doesn't and they don't they're sheltered enough to not see it and not know
Right.
someone who's struggling with that, or at least they don't realize it, because I think there's a lot of people in my life who have no idea that I'm living in a camper. So there's
Mm-hmm.
Right.
that. Um
Right.
and they don't have to see it, so it doesn't seem like a problem. And I think that that's what's so dangerous about what's going on in the evangelical movement right now is it's insulated from any experience beyond what m- makes them comfortable. I don't want to be too
Yes.
harsh, but I think that's true. And so then why should they care about, I mean, and it's moralized, right? If someone's not
Yes.
doing well, It's
Right.
because
It's their fault.
they don't love God
Yeah.
enough, or they're not devoted enough, or they, they're unrepentant
Right.
of sin or whatever it is.
They're
And
lazy,
therefore,
whatever it is.
yeah. So they don't work hard enough. And it's like, yeah, I I worked for 10 years at a
Mm.
ministry, worked my butt off,
Yep.
barely got paid anything, and still
Mm.
can't, I don't want to rant about myself, but like I can't afford hardly anything in my life. And I'm like,
Right.
where and
Right.
that's where I get frustrated is it's the evangelical movement seems to not be about the real world, and especially not
Yes.
about like your real neighbors. The people
Yes.
who really need your help are not the ones who are getting it.
Oh my goodness. I mean, again, we can be here forever, but you're so right. Number one, what evangelicals lack, and again, broad strokes, right? We all know that there are some good people in these things who see things differently, but by and large, there's no empathy for anything
Yeah.
outside of like their worldview, right? You're on welfare must be your fault. You can't afford to pay for things. Well, you didn't save enough. You didn't follow
Mm.
the Dave Ramsey plan. Whatever it is. There's always an excuse of why whatever you did is somehow your fault. Like
Right.
it's always your fault.
Right.
And if not, now you're just playing victimhood, right? And we can't have victims,
Mm.
right? So you have that. And then you have this evangelical industrialized institution that creates ivory towers for people in ministry. Like what pastors have legitimate, I'm going to use real churchy language here, but quote unquote, unsaved friends? Who?
Mm.
They don't. They're
Mm.
too busy making their own little kingdom happen
Yeah.
in this
Yeah.
fancy event, trying to be the next elevation, right? Looking at the budget, trying to figure out how they can raise more money to get the better lights or the better equipment. Meanwhile, their neighbor's starving. And they call it, oh, we had 4 salvations today. We had 20 salvations. We're doing it. Salvations, what? They prayed a prayer and raised their hand? Are you kidding me? Again,
Right.
what Bible are we reading? Like, please show me the chapter and verse that says, if you pray this prayer and raise your hand, that's it. Because Matthew 7 says quite the opposite. Only those who do the will of the Father will enter the kingdom. So we are so selective in our theology, in our application in the evangelical movement. And it honestly is maddening. I mean, I live in New Jersey. We have very poor areas right in the heart of Jersey, and also Philadelphia, which is on track to have over 600 homicides this year. It's terrible.
Mm.
There
Mm.
are churches all over the place, and we're too busy building up our own little Sunday morning events, getting volunteers to do live stream, to do production, to serve and to greet, than to feed the poor. Because
Mm.
we in our mind, feeding the poor is, well, are we enabling? Well, what if they use this money for drugs? Like what? Where are these qualifications in scripture? They're not
Mm.
there. So the evangelical church is really a political entity of right-wing conservative politics that then looks at the Bible to justify their view. It's not the opposite.
Mm.
The lens of historic Christian thinking, especially around the quote unquote least of these, is not the first lens for the church. First, it's America, it's consumerism, it's capitalism, it's conservatism. Then we look in the Bible and we find our proof text, and there's our theology. It's
Mm.
totally ass backwards.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and also not to continue down the road, but when church is sold out to like a business model,
Totally.
and it's all about growth, it's all about bringing people in, it's all
Yep.
about building the
Yep.
next building and all the satellite campuses. I mean, there's just they are building little mini empires, and
Exactly.
it's also quite, I don't know, coincidence that all of the church planting movements tend to be in white, suburban, wealthy
Mm.
neighborhoods.
Yep.
I mean, maybe that's different in the Northeast, but it's in Colorado, every non-denom church that is
Hmm.
planting a new church, it
Yeah.
just so happens to be in the nice part of town.
How
And that's a
convenient.
that's a business decision. It's not a
Totally.
gospel decision.
Mm.
Oh my gosh, you're on the money. And that's, people have asked me, well, Tim, do you ever want to plant a church? I'm like, hell no. No. We don't need more church plants. Our
Right.
America is in New Jersey. I did the math like 10 years ago. There's one church every 3 square miles on average in New Jersey. Okay. We
Wow.
have
And
enough churches.
and that's the godless Northeast, right?
That's the
Like
godless Northeast. We are happily so. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, you're exactly right. And so we don't have a church. Church planting, man. Church planting is code for I don't like how they did things. I can do it better. So I don't want any oversight. That's what that is for so
Mm,
many people, right? It's, oh, I'm going to plant the church. I'll make a living doing this somehow, and I can do it better. And by better, we mean a better event, better systems, better volunteers, a better vision. It all comes down to system. There's no sense of real community. Or what happens is even worse. People with good intentions say, I want to build a community, but they fall back into the church institutionalized model, and they realize quickly how it's automatically at odds with itself. Because for the institution to work, it has to grow. For it to grow, you need more overhead. More overhead means more money. More money means you have to get more people in the door. So immediately you're sacrificing community and even conviction because you have to grow your little empire, like you said, Gary Allen, as opposed to just a community who isn't really concerned if the pastor's paid or not, but instead you're a group in a local neighborhood meeting, eating meals together, being just friends. And then the overflow of that is you love your neighbors in tangible ways. That's a very different model for our culture, but a very biblical one historically, I believe.
And it goes back to you love them regardless of if they believe what you believe.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
I mean, I feel like that is a huge part of what is missing and what's pushing so many of us out of the evangelical churches is the ability to stay in relationship with people who don't think exactly like us.
yep,
And,
yep.
and it's always like, well, you're staying in sin, so I can't be in relationship with you. And it's like, what? That makes
But
no
you hate
sense.
your neighbor.
Yeah.
Like, that's
Yeah.
sinful too.
Well, no,
It's bonkers.
but not only that, it's like to truly evangelize, if we're going to go back to the word that the name comes from, it's people who need Jesus. And so it's people who don't think they need Jesus or who don't believe in you know, like if that's really our motivation, if we're really going to evangelize like evangelicals say, then
Yeah.
you can't reach people if you're telling them like you don't even believe in Jesus, but you need to repent of your sin right now or else I won't even like be friends with you anymore. That doesn't.
Not only that, can I give you a little dark, dirty secret of evangelical church growth? Most of it is from church plants.
Right.
Mm,
You're just shuffling people around.
Mhm.
Very
yeah.
few
Mhm.
are genuine quote unquote conversions. Most church growth is I left this church, I go here. And again, why? Well, it makes sense because we have these huge buildings and events. We have now the big thing is having these greeters, right? With like signs. So glad you're here, VIP, put your flashers on. That's awkward. Like, I don't want to be singled out. Like the gauntlet of happiness, get it away from me. So again, like we're trying to sell tickets to a free event. That's what we're trying to do. And
Mhm.
that's not real evangelism, quote unquote. That's not loving your neighbor. That's not making a disciple. That's making spectators.
Mm.
So they give you money and you can keep doing your event and calling it, the kingdom. And I hate to sound so negative about it, but that's why I have this account. Like we're trying to reclaim this, like, no, we need to rethink all this. And if it is too controversial for you, then you have to rethink like what you really believe. Because again, this is a very new model of church. Mega church in this way is like, it's like 30 years old
Right.
out of
Right.
2,000 years of church history. Right? The church historically has been oppressed most of its life. They've usually been the ones on the bottom, not on top. I mean, obviously we have the Roman Empire, but in the grand scheme of things, most
Right.
Christians historically were either persecuted or just seen as kind of the fringe, really. And now that we have all this power in the world's greatest country, we are power hungry. And that's not the way of the suffering servant, right? That's not the way of the risen Christ.
But see,
And
So
I
we have to
wonder
rethink
if
it.
it's even possible, really. I guess maybe
Mm,
this might be where I differ from you in terms of like we need a new evangelicalism is like if we're if we need to like prove that it's successful, if we need to like have metrics of saying like, well, we we grew by this many people and we had this many
yeah.
conversions and we had this and we had that and there's like it's not about like things that can't be measured, then I don't know if it's
Yes.
reformable, if that makes
Right.
sense.
No, it makes complete sense. And, I wrestle with that a lot. And I think in a lot of ways, I even am a victim of the evangelical culture in the sense of I use evangelical and like the church kind of interchangeably. And obviously they're different
mhm.
things. I believe that evangelical churches are part of the capital C church, but clearly the capital C church is much more diverse than the
Mm,
evangelical movement,
yeah.
right? But,
Right.
my hope is to hopefully give people in these spaces, or even people who don't know, people who think evangelical, right-wing Trump supporter, right? Like people who think that way, hope that not only are Christians not all like that, because again, most people assume Christian evangelical are one and the same culturally. They don't understand mainline versus,
Mhm.
evangelical. So I'm just trying to use the most popular term and
Mm.
just trying to reclaim, in a sense, Christianity, in like a very public sense of like, we're not all right wing, anti vax, QAnon, Trump loving conservatives. I mean, I hate to sound dehumanizing in that way, but these things they're so big in evangelical culture. The anti-vax movement is huge. QAnon was fueled by like this sense of God and country. I read their books. God and
Mm.
Bible verses are plastered all over it. So even the insurrection on the 6th, we saw Jesus banners. It's
Oh, everywhere.
really it's really frustrating to see the church see that and go, "Oh, well, these aren't real Christians." It's like, "Are you crazy? They're in your
Yeah.
churches.
Yep.
These are congregants." So they're just very blind to their own problems. They're too busy judging culture, right? The quote unquote godless culture, to see that their own house is crumbling. It is crumbling. And they just can't see it.
Mm.
Yeah, I've almost gotten the courage every time I'm in the grocery store these days and I see someone that's not wearing a mask.
Yeah.
I've almost gotten the courage to just simply walk up to them and say, "Hey, can you tell me what church you go to?" Bec
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I know they're evangelicals.
Yes.
No one else is not doing this.
Yeah.
Everyone else knows that there is a virus, science is real, and
Right.
we want to care for our neighbors,
Yes.
and I'm not the most important. And do I like my mask? No. Am I tired of it? Of
No.
course. But guess what? I'm still wearing it because I don't want to get somebody else sick. And when we
Yes.
have Christians that are seeing the entire world as you can't tell me what to do,
Yep. Yep.
there's an entire problem with the movement. There's
Oh,
no
yeah.
transformation taking place. It's
Yep.
we are raising up an entire generation of people who look exactly opposite of Jesus, and that's when I say it's time to shut it down.
I
Um,
wish I could say you're wrong, but I see it. I mean, I get it. I like we just talked about for the past 20 minutes now, like there it's a very unholy alliance of a lot of things, and it's a big spaghetti bowl because everything's connected. Every strand intersects with a different strand somewhere that you can't see. And
mm,
it's a very hard web to unpack, and to say, okay, what are the connections here? But I do think for what it's worth, I do think that between deconstructing Christians, especially evangelicals, a lot of us are who grew up in this church culture are really rethinking it. Right, I'm one of millions. I'm no one special here. I think that hopefully there is hope because the church is due for reformation. Every
mm,
500 years a reformation happens historically. Last one was in 1500s. It's 2020. So we're really due for like a big movement that hopefully shifts things. The evangelical church will is no exception to that rule. So I'm hoping we're seeing the beginning of a real rethinking. Even I'm not sure if you guys know who Russell Moore is. He's a
mhm,
pretty
yep,
big,
yep,
like, evangelical guy,
Mhm.
has been very outspoken on so many things. I've messaged him like, "Dude, you're a breath of fresh air,"
right,
explaining how dangerous Trump is. David French from the French Press, another great evangelical writer. The Holy Post with Sky Jitani and Phil Vischer from VeggieTales, either evangelical, but man, like
right.
they are just doing the work. So it gives me hope that there's an underground subculture of people who are just are getting these like social media platforms and just trying to push. And I'm hoping if there's enough of us, we could do some good damage.
Yeah, you can type your 95 theses up on your Instagram account, your new
Exactly.
reformation,
Yes. And then pin it. Boom.
and pin it up
Pinned.
there, right? Yep. So you kind of just talked about this, but we do always love to end the show with hope. And in particular this show because let's just be honest, we've kind of poked the bear a little bit and
Mm.
we've exposed a lot of the things, given language to a lot of the things that we're frustrated with about church and we're frustrated with about the movement that formed us but has abandoned us. So when you look at your work, when you look at the future of faith, what, if anything, gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who are deconstructing. Most of them want a more robust faith. So I feel like they're kind of like little seeds in the ground right now, right? And they're kind of replanting, and all of our roots are kind of taking new depths, and they're just kind of taking form. But I hope that eventually blossoms into like a whole new movement of Christians who are very socially minded and socially focused, who want to do tangible good in the world. So that I think that gives me hope. I meet these people all the time. Your podcast, we had that interview, I guess a little while ago with some other podcasters
Mm,
where we were all on. It was just it was very nice. Like, yeah, like, okay,
Mm,
cool. There's a little bit of camaraderie here. It's a nice feeling to know that we're not alone in this. And I do think, like I said, there still are good people in the popular Christendom, evangelical culture, Bible Project. NT Wright's a great scholar in this regard, and so on and so forth, who are doing really important work. And that definitely gives me hope. The good news is that the Christian faith did not start with us; it will not end with us.
mm.
Even an evangelical church that is so wayward can't stop like the good news that there is a God who wants to redeem all things. That's a beautiful story, and I think that will continue on no matter what.
mm.
Wow.
Well, I'm glad we ended on that because that was a lot. We talked about a lot. And I feel like it was very serious and as I mean, I think everybody can tell we all are very passionate about this because it matters a lot to us. So if you heard our passion, sorry. But so because of that, I feel like we need a little bit of fun and lightheartedness. So our listeners know that we like to ask everybody some fun questions at the end, but you probably don't know that yet, Tim. So do you mind if we just do like
Let's
some
do it.
fun rapid fire questions?
Sure.
Okay, so just go with your gut.
All right.
Quickest thing that comes to mind. All right, first question. If you could have one superpower, what would it be?
Flight.
Ooh, why?
Flight, man, that was quick.
Yeah.
I thought about it.
You just really want to fly over the
Uh,
whole
I
globe?
just something about that being free, no traffic, right? Most
Ooh.
direct route. Like that's just a cool vibe.
Mm.
I like that. All right. What's your most used emoji?
It used to be like the crying laughter one that was straight, but now I do the crooked one because I read an article that Gen Z uses that one, and I don't want to get
Oh,
outdated.
See, I read an article that
cool with
said
the
they use
kids.
the like skull because it's dead now. Like
Well, I use that one a lot too.
oh, okay, okay.
But,
Oh,
like, the number one emoji is definitely the, like, slanted, I'm laughing so hard" emoji for sure.
Yeah, we gotta stay hip. If someone were to play you in a movie, who would it be?
Oh, goodness. Gerard Butler.
Ooh.
wow.
I've been told
Nice.
that when I grow my beard out, we look very similar. I mean, I don't have the physique that he had in 300, but that is my dream physique. If I can ever end up, like, as ripped as Gerard Butler or any of those good-looking men in that movie, I would do it.
Mm,
Yeah.
But I like
I
fast
look
food.
mm.
Problematic.
yeah. I look like the guy on the Weather Channel, so there's no hope.
No, you look like the drummer Kenny Arnoff. That's what you look like to me.
Oh, okay. All right.
He
I'll have to
drums for
look him
Goo Goo
up.
Dolls. He's really good.
Oh.
Nice. All right. Hey, so what is the best piece of advice anyone has ever given you?
Um, it was a question that was given to me. I think that was one of the most powerful questions that changed my life. Is what you're doing now going to matter 100 years from now?
Hmm.
Mm, mm.
Yeah. That changed my life.
Well, way to send me into an existential crisis with that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question. What's the
Hmm.
last text you sent?
Let's take a look. Um, I have a call with a web developer at 8 my time. Do you have time to make it? To my admin.
Mm,
That's the last one.
Nice.
juicy.
And I just got a text that dinner's ready from my wife. So
Oh,
that's perfect.
Hey,
perfect
Perfect
that's
timing.
awesome.
timing.
Woohoo. Well, hey Tim, this has been so fun and convicting on many levels. For those of us who want to know more about you and your work that you're doing online and your podcast, where can we direct them?
Sure. Yeah. You can find me on Instagram at the New Evangelicals, Twitter at New Evangelicals, no E, because New Evangelicals was taken, which is a bummer. And I have a podcast, the New Evangelicals podcast.
Awesome. I want to make sure to put all that in the show notes too, so everybody can find you there as well.
Oh, super kind. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us today, Tim. This was such a great conversation and really honestly convicting with how kind and loving you are toward the people who may frustrate you. I think we all need to get better at not dehumanizing, as you said. So thank you for your time and thank you for this conversation. And hopefully we can have another one in the future.
Hey, I know that I annoy people, and they're still my friends. So I got to pass it on, right?
Yeah.
That's
Thanks
right.
again. I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
All right, man. Thank you.
And that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And before you go, we'd like to ask you to consider becoming a Patreon patron of this humble little show. It may not seem like it, but it takes hours upon hours to create each episode and get them out to you each week. And whether you knew this or not, it's just me and Gary Allen with my husband Josh doing all the editing simply out of the goodness of his heart. So your contributions to the show will not only help us to continue producing quality content, it also gets you access to each show 5 days early. You get exclusive content and first dibs on merch when we finally get to that point. Every little bit helps, so head to patreon.com/holyheretics to become a patron. Thank you. This episode was produced by the Sophia Society. Music is by Faith in Foxholes, and sound engineering is by Joshua Mudge.